Howdy, partners. Y'all listen up because I'm going to talk about hearing now. I apologize. No, I sincerely apologize. I know I took that a little too far. I'm just trying to stay entertained without having a live class to teach you. Put this hat on so my hair, my bald head doesn't shine too much with this overhead light. Let's talk about hearing. Now, Mr. Woodard did a great job talking about frequency, amplitude. There's not much for me to review. I'm going to take frequency to the next step as we talk about transduction within the ear. Remember, transduction, how are we going to take some sort of stimulus that's out in the world, turn it into a neural impulse so that our brains can interpret them? So here we have our ear. By the way, the inner ear is crazy. It is so complex, and there's so much stuff going on in there. It helps us not only with hearing, but with our equilibrium, with our balance. Fluid within our ears actually helps us to stay upright and know up from down. So the inner ear is incredibly complex. So I'm just going over the basics because AP Psychology, they just want you to know the basics of hearing. Okay, so we've got our outer ear here. It's called the pinna. And then there's the tunnel here. And then we have the tympanic membrane. Now, the tympanic membrane is better known as the eardrum. So don't stick the Q-tip in too far and rupture your eardrum, right? And this is the first place where those sound waves are going to take a vibrational form, because that tympanic membrane, this very light membrane, is going to start vibrating when sound waves hit it. Attached to the tympanic membrane are the smallest bones in our body, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. They're three little tiny bones that are all kind of connected to one another and to that tympanic membrane. And the last one in that series is the stirrup, and that's actually connected to yet another membrane that's the opening or the beginning of what we call the cochlea. More on that in a second. Now, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, just so you'll know, they literally look like a little hammer, a little anvil, and a little stirrup. That's why they're called that. Their formal names are Malleus, Incus, and Stapes. Okay? I don't believe I've ever seen their formal names on the AP exam. Hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Together, they're called the ossicles. I do want to say that there was a question about the ossicles on an AP exam once. All right, so sound wave comes in, vibrates the tympanic membrane, which in turn vibrates the three bones, which in turn moves this little membrane here. And what that does is, within our inner ear, in this cochlea, there's fluid, and there's little hair-like cells that are in that ear, or in that structure, the cochlea. It looks like a little snail. Once that fluid inside the cochlea starts to create little waves, there's little waves there, then another organ that you don't have to worry about comes into play with this as well. Basically, those waves are translated into the auditory nerve, and transduced into that auditory nerve and become neural impulses that our brain can then interpret. How loud something is, what the pitch is, what the timbre is, etc. So our brain's going to interpret it later on, but it all starts with a sound wave that has to hit that tympanic membrane and create literal waves in fluid within our inner ear. Now, the cochlea has this other structure that's going to be important for a couple of slides from now, and that's called the basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane is floating in the liquid in the fluid within our inner ear. So it's going to vibrate as well. As the fluid creates waves, that basilar membrane is going to wave slightly as well. I'm going to talk about that here in a second, because the AP Psychology test does like a couple of theories about how we hear pitch. Okay. Come on here. There we go. Okay, now before we get into that pitch, though, there is a slide here with deafness. If you have conduction deafness, this often happens with damage to the middle or inner ear. So we're talking before that snail-like structure, before the cochlea. If there's damage, that damage is oftentimes called or caused by ear infections or some sort of illness, repeated fluid in the ear that isn't released. That's why a lot of children get little tubes in their ears, because they're getting a lot of inner ear infections, and the fluid's not draining well enough, and so that can cause that damage. That's conduction deafness. Guys like me I'm a little bit worried about this. Nerve deafness. So caused by damage to cells in the cochlea and beyond. This often naturally occurs with age. Listening or working in a really loud environment or listening to loud music over and over often causes deafness like this. The lead singer for AC/DC actually had to stop performing a few years ago because he couldn't hear anymore. You'll oftentimes see musicians with the pieces in their ear to help them hear their own voices, number one, but there's also a noise deafening or a noise canceling property to them as well. So they don't have that loud noise with them all the time. Okay, that's nerve deafness. So nerve deafness, cochlea and beyond, conduction deafness is up to the cochlea. In fact, if you ever go to a really loud concert, it doesn't mean that you have nerve deafness, but if you go to a really loud concert and you can't get that ringing out of your ears for a while, that's because a lot of those receptor cells have been affected and they continue to have that effect for a little while. Too long, obviously, or being exposed to that too long, then you get into the nerve deafness. Okay, back to that basilar membrane. There are two theories of how we hear pitch, and this kind of goes back to the theories of seeing color as well. It's kind of like there are two theories that might look like they're opposed, but actually can start to work together. And the more investigating I've done, it looks like both of them can have echoes of being right. So place theory, if you think about that basilar membrane and it's floating in the liquid and then it starts to vibrate, the place theory says where on the basilar membrane that those vibrations are taking place, that's how we hear pitch. Frequency theory says how often the basilar membrane is stimulated. Now, here's how I think they kind of work together. If you watch some videos, the basilar membrane actually starts off kind of thin and then it broadens out a little bit. Higher pitched noises won't travel down that basilar membrane as far. Lower pitched noises will actually travel down the basilar membrane further. So it's kind of like both, because if you get a really high pitch and you have like super fast frequency, it's only going to travel down the basilar membrane so far. So it's frequency and place because it stops at a certain place. Lower frequencies are going to travel down that basilar membrane farther. So again, it's lower frequency, but it's also the place that they'll end up on the basilar membrane. Hope that makes some sort of sense. It's kind of an interesting dispute out there in the world of hearing. Okay, on to touch. Now, we don't do a whole bunch with transduction as far as touch is concerned, but one of the terms that pops up quite often is gate control theory. Have you ever hit your hand on a desk all of a sudden or kicked your shin, and what's the first thing you do? You start to rub it, right? Okay. Gate control theory is the idea that we have these thicker nerve fibers that are very fast. These are the fibers that are used for normal sensations. So just touching the desk, putting on the hat, those fast or thicker nerve fibers are actually what are being used. So we're using them constantly. Well, if I accidentally hit my hand on the desk, all of a sudden these slower, thin fibers come into play. Those slow fibers come into play to send pain up to the brain. However, the idea of gate control is that the body is saying which messages they're going to let go through. If you start rubbing your hand after hitting it on a desk, you're activating those thicker nerve fibers, and the body is more receptive to those. And so you can actually kind of block the gate of those thinner fibers. It's not really a gate structurally, but it's the concept of what the body is going to let through to the brain. And the thick fibers will always win over the thinner fibers. Now, if you're in a severe amount of pain, you can't just necessarily rub it away because there's more activation of those thin fibers. Okay. All right, I have talked for 10 minutes, and yeah, we're on to taste. Mr. Woodard gets a couple of good ones with taste and smell here. So I'll stop there. We will see you later.